Good morning. We are in the middle of Rebbe's Maimer, Bik Hashem Avekenu, on page 374. Yeah, 374. Middle of 374. Right at the beginning of understanding the power and the avodah of Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which is the most famous liturgy, prayer, and the most fundamental, as we see how many times we say it every day, and the times of the year when we say it, the highest point of Yom Kippur. And in general, it's that verse that always captured the ultimate faith of the Jewish people, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. The context of this Maimer, which is based on the Alter Rebbe's Maimer, and is the basis of the Ayin Beis Hemshech, the end of Ayin Beis, he calls it the Yesod, the mitzvah. Yichud Elikuz B'Krishma is the Yesod l'chol ha-mitzvahs. And this is brought also in the Sifrei HaMitzvahs, the different, those that enumerate the mitzvahs, the Rambam, the Ramban, the Rasag, all those that when they describe all the mitzvahs in the Torah, Shema Yisrael is always the foundational one. Because it declares unity, which is the essence of all mitzvahs. That we're not independent agents. We're not here to serve ourselves. We're here to serve God. What is the essential statement? That God is reality and created us to fulfill his purpose in existence, which is to make a dir b'tachtein. So the very essence of Torah and mitzvahs, the very essence of creation, is about manifesting the divine in existence. In the words of the language here, yichud. So we just began, yesterday I gave a larger overview of what the significance of Achdus Hashem is, why it's so important, and why it's critical that it be also exclusive. Not like there's a partnership between us and God, but that's the only one God, Yachid, Echad. And now we're going to continue learning the details, which essentially is the contemplation of what a Nefesh Elokis is focusing on when it's saying Shema, which in turn has now the listening ear of the animal soul, because after the introductions to Shema, Birchas Yetzer and Avos Elam, like he explained, and before that, Psukei de Zimra, so the animal soul is now engaged. But the Shema, as he calls it, the Iker Birur, Inyan HaBirur hu Iker Inyan HaBirur is in Shema. Because Shema is going to turn V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'chol levavcha b'shnei yitzarecha. So with all the warming up and with all the softening and all the education and inspiration of the animal soul, it's not yet at a state of loving God together with Shnei Yitzarecha, Chol Levavcha, together with the divine soul. That's ultimately where we want to reach. And of course, Ayin Beis on page 1466, all the way till the end, 1477, 77? Make sure. I believe so. The end, literally the end, was all about this yichud that we, 1477, from 1466, is all about this yichud. It's all based on what we're going to be learning now in the Mittler Rebbe's Maimer. And as I said, it all begins with a few lines in the Alter Rebbe's Maimer in Torah, which we had learned already. So, with that said, let's enter into the thick of things. So he started out by saying, this is what we summed up yesterday, that after explaining the Birchas Yetzer, Me'ati Yashlema Be'ikrin Habir Hazeh, that the Nefesh Elokis can refine the animal soul to the point of getting it stimulated, aroused with the love, B'chol Shnei Yitzarecha, That's the whole Indian of Shema Yisrael, is to achieve V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha b'shnei tzorecha. So now he says Shema is from the word Havana, which means Avchana Teva, a very clear, crystal clear understanding and discernment. B'moyach v'lev, and that is the understanding and the appreciation and the internalization of the mitzvah yichud elikus, which is Yisei kol ha-mitzvahs. And then he gives a short summary or a short overview of what this mitzvah of yichud is. Would be a klolasinya ha-yichud elyon hazeh. What is the klolasinya of this unification? Shemavayir mafarish eich shavaya lekenu havaya chod. It comes to explain how havaya lekenu is havaya chod, and that is that sort of chod. This is what the person has to concentrate on, and to align his heart well. The ikra yichud b'mamala v'seviv, the divine that manifests within existence. In Ayin Beis he spelled it out, and here he will also. That's Hashem Echad, or Baruch Shem, more broadly, and Seviv is Hashem Elokeinu, the transcendent entry. Bechlal ubefrat, it's the language of the Mittler Rebbe. I read yesterday from Ayin Beis where he spells it out a bit more, that there's the Yichud of Mamala Kalam, the Yichud of Seviv, and the Yichud of both these Yichudim. Again, all this will be elaborated upon as we go on. And that's why we say a person has to be ma'irich. In general, the expression is ma'irich be'echad. But in the echad itself, the dalet of echad, which is malchus of atzilus, that is the source that creates all of existence. Yesh ma'ayin liyesh. That's the tachlis hayud that yichud eloah lekis. So we say, we're contemplating on what? That Malchus, which is the creative force of the divine that creates all of existence, is what sustains it all, Yesh Ma'ayin. Meaning all of existence is completely ayin, well, say Yesh, but completely infinitely distant from that, from the ayin alakif from Malchus. And that's the Tachas HaYichud, the Yichud Elah Elikis, the divine higher union. He doesn't spell out the details here, but he will. Just beginning by just laying out the key words, and then he'll explain it. Now, since we learned it already in Ayin Beis, you probably have a sense of what he's going to be explaining, but we'll read it inside. And that's where we stopped. In Ayin Beis, the parallel to where we are right now is the bottom of page 1466 and the top of 1467. What we're going to learn now is the top of 1467 in Ayin Beis. Yesh ma'ayin. So in the Ayin Beis, it begins with Bira Inyan Hu. So he's going to say now like this. So this, besides the learning the idea, remember, is this is the very contemplation of the divine soul that influences and impacts and explains it well to the animal soul. So what we're learning now, think of it as the Mittler Rebbe giving us language for the divine soul to concentrate on, and in turn explain it to the animal soul. That's really the process here, and he's going to tell us what his bunus is in detail. Now, when you learn all these details, you come to realize why some people, when they davened Shema, it took them an hour and a half to say Shema. You could say it's only one line. How long can you say it? But when you understand all its meaning and implications, that person can concentrate it like keeping in mind all these different details that are meant to help elevate our consciousness from a existential one to a divine one. So here's what he starts. The Pirish begins with Ma'ayin liyesh. Pirish Ma'ayin liyesh zeo Ma'ayin mamish v'lo yesh miyesh. First thing is, we need to know that the creation is Ma'ayin liyesh. Literally means not just from nothing something, it means from two different paradigms. That it's not coming yesh miyesh. Yesh miyesh is everything man-made, everything we're familiar with, is taking one entity and reshaping it into another. Even when you tap into, for example, subatomic energy, you're not creating new energy. The energy is there. However, it's locked, it's trapped, it's concealed. So you're drawing it out. So it's all yesh mi yesh. Yesh ma'ayin is a very different type of thing, and it's only reserved for God. Only God can create yesh ma'ayin, because creation cannot create something. Creation can adapt, can reshape, can remodel, can realign. Even when scientists do wondrous things through synthetic materials or medications, at the end of the day, they're taking different substances and turning it into something else. It's only the creator that yesh ma'ayin. But what's the significance of yesh and ayin? Yesh ma'ayin, as I explained yesterday, and now we're going to learn inside, the key thing to remember are 2 points that he makes in ayin beis. One is that there's nothing in common about them. Existence is not an extension of God in the sense of godliness. It's a creation of us. God is the producer, and this is the product. And number 2, as we're going to learn, it doesn't impact the creator. These are all critical pieces in understanding Shema Yisrael, Shem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and ultimately affecting the animal soul. As I explained yesterday, if you give any credence to the yesh that has something in common with the ayin, you're giving it power that means that somewhere it's not completely bottled to Elokus. So let's learn now what he's going to, how he explains it here. This is the primary mistake of the philosophers. Interesting that he has that. And also, to some extent, in the early Kabbalists, putting them into one comparison, comparing them. In Ayin Beis, he didn't bring Mukabalim. He just brought Zeu Tos HaPhilasufim. If you look on top of page 1467, he just says that's the mistake of the philosophers. Here he says also the early Mukabalim. He doesn't say who they are, but in the footnote, if you look, they bring several Maamorei from the Alter Rebbe that talks about this. I'm going to look them up. It's just interesting, intriguing to know who they are and how he equates them. But when you look at this, you come to understand, because the early Kabbalists, some of them, they didn't, God forbid, have a lack of faith in the Creator, like, say, philosophers, like he says in Shari Yuchad Amuna, who deny that they compare existence to creations that human beings create. Is that the Kabbalists thought that God does not get involved in creation. So basically, the godly energy reserved for creation is more of yesh miyesh than yesh ma'ayin. Essentially, that so-called the dimensions of God that are beyond existence are not involved in existence. But we'll talk about this some more later, just explaining why he says Mukabalim Rishenim. Sheyozdu be'ikir, they established primarily Inyan Hayesavas Abriya, the creation of existence of Min Habedi Yisborach Shu B'derech Kol Shefa. They understood creation like all hashpas, as it is with every flow. The mashpia, the makabel, from a mashpia to makabel. And in what form does that take? Shehu nikra ilav ol. A mashpia makabel is cause and effect. The mashpia is the cause, the makabel is the effect. Shamashpia nikra ilah, mashpia is called the cause. V'animshach b'menu nikra, and that which extends from him is called the effect. The cause and effect. So that's how they mistakenly understood the creation, the form of shefa. Like, for example, water coming out of a spring, or fire or spark coming out of a source of fire. That's how they understood it. Sheyesh erech, and in that context, yesh erech v'ishtavus la'ol imayila. There's something in common and something similar between the two. They're not infinitely distant. A mashpia makabel, like it is with seichel or any form of mashpia makabel, there's something commensurate and in common among them. Kamoy ha-Talmud.
How are you teaching Hishtachavus?
I just said something in common or commensurate.
Thank you.
Shava, from the word shava, similar.
Okay. Understood. Thank you.
Like a student that's receiving intelligence from his teacher. That immediately makes something in common, a common denominator, the erech, the commensurate between the Talmud and the Rav. As much as the Rav is higher level than the student, but you can't say they're infinitely apart because the student is understanding and receiving something from this teacher that makes sense to him. I'm not getting it at the level of his understanding. But you can't, but that's a classic yesh mi yesh ilav ol. V'gam zen nikri yesh mi yesh. And also this is called yesh mi yesh. Ki ein kol chodesh mi korei b'shefel seichel zeh. Because nothing new is fundamentally being conveyed in this flow of seichel. Shenimshech mikamoishu b'seichel harav. It's extending from the way it is in the seichel harav, even if it goes through a tzimtzum concealment and it goes through different partitions, mishalim examples. Like we learned about mishalim and parsoyes, partitions. But it comes from the Rav. V'chein, another example he's giving now for this. K'moy moyer hashemesh hameir b'levana. Another classic example of mashpia makabel is the sun and the moon. So think of how the k'moy moyer hashemesh or moyer hashemesh, either way, that the light or the luminary of the sun radiates from that light, radiates b'levana, in the moon. So there again, the sun is obviously far more powerful and far greater light than the moon, but the moon is reflecting it. So the moon is receiving something, yesh mi yesh, not something completely new. And the third example, ukeshefa mayim mikeli al keli, like the flow of water from one vessel to another, like from a pitcher to a cup, or from a cup to a cup. And finally, he gives a fourth example. Ukenesina, the asher la'ani, and like the bestowing or the giving of a wealthy person to a pauper, basically giving tzedakah. It's another hashpah from mashpia to makabel. Ukahai gavna, which means etc. and similar. So he gave different examples of yesh mi yesh, ilav olul, that there is something in common between the two levels. Just to check, I want to just see in Ayin Beis, he gave some of these examples. He gave their seichel and midas, which the Mittler Rebbe here does not bring. But I recall, if I recall correctly, afterwards, he gave the example, I think, of the usher. Yeah, here's the example of the usher and the ani. Hashpas usher el ani, hashpas muhuz davar. Okay, closer to the end of the paragraph on 1467. Now is not a place to get into why the Rebbe Rashab only brings brings the different examples and brings only one of these. But regardless, it's interesting to note. Okay. Now, so the key line here is that there's something in common. There's more to say about that, and Ayin Beis he elaborates more, but I want to first see what the Mittler Rebbe says, then we'll do comparison to the Ayin Beis. Okay. Mittler Rebbe continues now, that this, to further explain and appreciate Yesh Ma'ayin, he's first elaborating on Yesh Mi Yesh, and coming to say that the philosophers and the early Kabbalists had it wrong, because they compared creation God's creation, yesh ma'ayin to yesh miyesh. But to appreciate yesh ma'ayin, we have to understand what yesh miyesh is. She says, v'chein yuvan. Well, let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything. Let's stop for a moment before I continue. That was pretty clear, but still.
It's hard to understand about the Mekubalim.
Not if you know the topic, and it's not hard to understand. I gave a little taste of it, because, as I said, the Mekubalim, especially talk about, they did not say that God is not infinitely distant. They just said in the process of creation, God behaved like a yesh miyesh, meaning that only the lowest levels of godliness are invested in creation. But we'll talk about that, as I said, as we go along. If what I said is not enough, I'll explain it. Or, like I said, he does give us some notes down below in the footnotes. They give us some references to other places that this is discussed. I've discussed a number of times throughout the years in Ayin Beis that different Mekubalim have different ways of understanding how we interact, how we interface between ourselves and God, that we're infinitely distant. And there are those Mekubalim that say that we don't interface with Atzmus. That's completely beyond us. Or even higher levels, not Atzmus, but even higher levels. But we interact more like with Mamalakalam. Mamalakam is more Lefi Erech. But as I said, I'll reserve to explain this later because it's not so relevant to our. Let's first discuss the details of what he says, and then we'll go back to that when need be.
Is the main point of the difference between, in this context, yesh miyesh versus yesh ma'ayin, that yesh ma'ayin is two things primarily: infinitely distant or different on the one hand, and also there's no shinui in the cause, or in the ayin it can create but doesn't affect it, whereas in the other yesh miyesh there's some effectual relationship between the cause.
If you learn that in Ayin Beis, you're correct. But since we're just beginning to learn the Mittler Rebbe, I'd rather him explain it. He hasn't gotten to yesh ma'ayin yet.
Okay.
Right now he's talking yesh miyesh. He's going to go to yesh ma'ayin, and
but to understand what he means by the mistake of the first Mekubalim, we don't know what that means other than what you're saying.
So then you know what? Look, then I tried to explain it briefly. If it's not clear, let's leave it for now. We'll discuss it later.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Now he continues. V'chein yuvan gam b'koich hapoel b'pu'ula. This, I believe, the Rebbe Rashab did cite as well. Yeah, at the bottom of the page. Or maybe not, maybe later. The same is will be understood, this idea, when we talk about koich hapoel b'pu'ula. Koich hapoel b'pu'ula. So now we're talking about, what does that refer to? That refers to the power to do something. Let's say the power to throw an object. And pula is the actual throwing of the object. So there's a relationship between your faculty, between your capacity, and the actualization of that capacity. So when a person takes, let's say, a stone and throws it, he's not commanding the stone to fly, and he doesn't touch it. He has to invest himself. He has to move close to the stone, hold it a certain manner, and determine how much energy he's going to apply to throw the stone. He doesn't say stone, talk about an object.
Light here, shine the
Meaning, he's taking that energy, that strength that he has, or that power, and he's investing it in the object that he's creating. In the object that he's creating, or in the object that he's activating. V'gam haseichel, This applies also to seichel. The gamma seichel shema'ayin be'echus ha'pu'ula melubish b'maisa zu. So not only is the power of, let's say in this case, throwing a stone, but also the seichel is also a koyach. He's using his mind to determine shema'ayin be'echus ha'pu'ula, to determine the quality of how much he's investing in it. So it needs to be a thought-through process. So it's melubish b'maisa zu. So what do you see? That when a person is doing something, he's not just blindly doing it robotically. There's an investment of the koyach. Basically, in this case, like the koyach hapoel and the power to create. This is where their mistake is. They are comparing creation to a person who's taking his power to create something. So let's say when we want to create, let's say you want to paint a painting, or you want to shape a piece of pot into pottery, a piece of clay into pot, or anything else. So there's an investment from the poil to the pool. Investment, both the power that you have with your very hands and also your mind, because you have to strategize and plan it. Like he says, Shema'ayim be'echus ha'poel melubish b'maisa zu. Harinimshach kulei b'maisa zu. So when the person is doing something, is actuating something, so his entire being is involved in this. He can't be doing a second thing. So nimshach kuli b'maisa zu, his mind, his focus, his faculties are being drawn into this action that he's creating. V'nifrad me'etzem koyach ha'seichel. And in some way, he gets separate from the koyach ha'seichel as it was in his mind before he applied himself to this. Just like that when you're putting your energy into the stone, what you're doing is you're investing in the stone energy that the stone will fly a certain distance. So there's a certain separation happening here from the person who's doing the activating to the action. Now, what does he mean, nifrad? He doesn't mean your seichel, your mind becomes less intelligent. It's not like you're giving away your intelligence, but he means to say that it is applying itself there. And while you're focusing there, you're not focusing on something else. So in a certain way, when a person now looks at, let's say, a beautiful painting, or looks at a beautiful pot, it didn't happen out of nowhere. That has invested in it the creative process of the producer, of the creator, of the artist that produced it. Both his intelligence and his actions and his energy is now inside that pot. When I say energy, not that you necessarily see a living energy, but it's a result and a product of the producer. So here he's going to understand these two things, the relationship between when he creates this product. Im Kain, says the Mittler Rebbe, Hinebe Daled Yud. So what's Daled Yud? Below in the manuscript they say it says Bechol Zeh. I'm not sure if Daled Yud makes sense. I mean, Daled Yud is usually Daled Yesedis. The Daled Yesedis, but it doesn't seem to fit here. We're not talking about Daled Yesedis unless he means the creation, the formation of Yesh Mayim Ruch Ofar. But since he didn't hint to it, it seems to come out of the blue. So if you look in below, the last footnote says B'chol Zeh. So basically, it was miswritten by the Maitik, by the one who copied it. So we'll go with that because I have no other way of explaining Daled Yud. Im Kain. So what do we derive from what we just learned? Hari B'chol Zeh. Yesh beis dvarim. There are two things here. As beis dvarim, erech v'ishtavus the olol le'ila. The first thing is that there's something commensurate and something in common that equalizes something commensurate of the olol and the le'ila, something similar of the result le'ila to the to the cause. That's one thing. And the second thing, that there's a spilus and shinui. There's a change, a shift. Hispilus sometimes means excitement. He doesn't mean here excitement. He means hispilus means that it's not a state of being aloof and detached. Hispilus means that the one who's activating it is somewhat affecting him. You could say it more like effect and change. Ben kedem hashefa, before the flow and after the flow. In all the examples he gave, we find these two things. Let's go through the examples. Let's go backwards. The last example was you throw a stone or anything that you're using your hand to do an action. So number one, there's something in common between the action and the one that's activating the action. Because he's investing his intelligence, his power, and so on. Second thing, there's a shinui in his palace, for sure. Because once you're involved in it, you can't be involved in something else. It's affecting you. You need to invest yourself in it. You can't do it in a detached way. In the other examples, every one of them. The example of, let's go through the 4 examples he gave. The student and the teacher. So obviously there's something in common, and the teacher has to invest himself, so there's a shinui in spilus. The example of the sun and the moon. So there, I don't know if there's a shinui in spilus, because it says the earth is not changed, the sun is not affected. So there maybe the second aspect may not apply, but the first one does, that there's something in common. The example of water, absolutely. The water is in common between one keli to the next, and it weakens. When you take water from one, there's less water. And finally, when the usher and the ani, there's something in common between them, and the usher has to invest himself when he's giving to the ani, and he has less physical money when he gives stock. So bottom line is, you see the 2 elements here that you see in the Yesh Yesh. One, there's something in common, and the second that has an impact on the giver or on the mashpia, on the first Yesh, on the ilah and ol. Ki nifrad b'shefa zu. So why is there a shinui? Because nifrad b'shefa zu. Something was separated. Something was extended. Something was the word I want to really use is invested or not exchange. Something invested. B'shefa zu koyach ma'atzmus l'fishu b'chinas yesh miyesh ki yadua. Next page, 375. Since it's yesh miyesh, so something from his very core power was divested, you can say, and was extended and given over. Like when a teacher and a student, the teacher actually gives into the student an intelligence that is now separated from him. Separated doesn't mean he doesn't have intelligence, just means that what he's done here is something of substance that has been carried over from one state to another state. So that's a shinui in his pilus. And that's how, what he said, the philosophers and some of the Mekabolim Rishonim understood creation. Now the Rebbe continues. Well, the EF Shalemer, top line 375. We cannot say kedugma zu like this example lamaila. Be'inyan hisavas and nevroim. That in fact you can't use these examples. Lamaila in the process of creating the creations. Shu ba b'derech ilah v'ol kanal. You can't say that it comes in the form of cause and effect. The im kain, because then yesh erech lebriya shu balgvul lebeira shu bilti balgvul. Because then that would indicate that there's something in common between the creation, which is finite, and the creator who's infinite. Ube'emes, and in truth, ein arech klal lenivra legaba habera. There's nothing in common. Ein arech klal, they're completely infinitely apart between the creation or the creature and the creator. Okay, so that's the distinction between Yesh Yesh and Yesh Ma'ayin. He didn't yet explain the Yesh Ma'ayin does not have the two things, nothing in common, and he'll soon explain that also no Shina and Ispilus, obviously, as well. But before we get there, let me stop here for a moment if anybody wants to ask anything. Okay. Continuing on. Begam. Imu kamoy keich hapoel benifol. That's the acronym. Now we have to now qualify something here. We know, fine, you've established that Yesh Ma'ayin, creation by God of the creation by the Creator, is not like anything else that we know of that has something in common. Fine, but we know that Eibishter does relate himself. He does engage with creation. He doesn't do it in a completely detached way. We've learned, and this is that the Eibishter said, what Kabbalah Chassidus calls this is koyach hapoel benifel. That there's a koyach hapoel, there's the power of the creator, of the producer in the product. So if we said that God is in heaven or in his spiritual realm, and he says, Vayemer Elikim Vatziva v'nivra, he's command, let there be creation. And there's nothing, he's not so-called engaging himself in it, kavyachol. Then, yeah, that's absolutely different than someone throwing a stone, or someone writing a book, or someone creating a piece of art, or a teacher teaching a student. But we know there's the concept of koyach hapoel benifel. There is an element where God does invest. So he's now going to qualify and explain how that works here. So he says, Gamim hu kamoy koyach hapoel benifel. And also, he's not im, he doesn't mean if. It means, and though there's also the element that the creation is the koyach hapoel benifel, the koyach hapoel is invested in the nifel, in the product. Hari behechlich sheyeh gam ha'pu'ula bilti mugbelas. B'koyach haliki habilti bal gvul. So then, based on that, you'd have to say, since the creator, the producer is bilti bal gvul, so then, since the pu'ula, he's investing in it, it should also be an extension of the infinite power of the divine. So how did that happen? That that finite was created from something was infinite. So he's now taking us back to why the philosophers or the Mukabolim Rishonim had their argument. So he's now bringing us back to that topic. Because here's the dilemma now. You have, on one hand, yes, fine, it's infinitely distant, but there's also some interaction between the two. So how exactly do you explain both? That there's interaction and still existence is finite and the creator is infinite. So he says that's why that's what bothered them. He's preferring them to the philosophers. How is it possible, if God is the creator and he's infinite, how did something new get created that's heva v'nifsed? Heva v'nifsed means it erodes. It's heva v'nifsed, it is a temporary entity. And is there's a word that I want to use. That's mutable, not immutable, but mutable. There's another word for mutable. It means it's subject to it's not erosion, deterioration. However, v'nifsed means it's in a state of constant state of erosion, basically, meaning it's finite and mortal. But I'm looking for a particular word. It'll come to me. So that's what bothers them. Since we see creation is not bli gvul, and the creator is bli gvul, so how does that work? That's why they come and say that the Eibishter's bli gvul remains apart. That the Eibishter vested himself, so to speak, like as if a koyach hapel benifel, like yesh mi yesh.
Do you mean
We'll soon see where he's
perishable?
going with this.
Do you mean perishable?
Perishable is a good word. Yeah, there's probably some other synonyms, but that's the idea. Yeah, perishable is a correct word. Yeah. V'gam oid siksha, and additionally, what bothers them, yiksha lehem, lefi zeh yesh shinei ben kedem abriya la'achar kach. And now we're going to start understanding why the Mekubalim Rishonim had this opinion as well. Because what bothers them is, how could there be there would be a shinui, because the creator is bilti balgvul. He now created something balgvul. That's a shinui. Because the koyach, I have to read all of this to really make sense of it. But the Mittler Rebbe is now going back to explaining the difference between the two approaches, but he's now explaining what bothered them to come away with saying that the creation is yesh mi yesh. So let's read it, and then we'll make order of it. So hari nimshach koyach eliki benifel v'nifred ma'atzmei. One second. Okay. The language is a bit going back and forth, so it gets a little confusing. But if I recall correctly, the Rebbe Rashab on page 1467, 1468 addressed all of this. And he spoke about it in a different type of language, but he's quoting straight from here. So I remember that but there it's a little more organized. So bottom line is, let me first explain what he's going to say, and then we'll read it inside. But give me a moment.
Is he saying that? Well, I'll just wait.
Well, based on how the Ayin Beis explains it, essentially what the Mittler Rebbe is doing here, he's going back and explaining the difference, but the way he's doing it is somewhat in his own style, basically saying like this. The only problem I have is with the opening line. Okay. essentially it's like this. According to the, first I thought that he was explaining what compels those philosophers to argue it's yesh mi-yesh. I may be wrong. I don't know if that's what he's coming to say. I'm leaning more now saying the following, that according to the approach yesh mi-yesh, we have a lot of problems. First problem is, how does bli gvul turn into gvul? If it's yesh ma'ayin, so that's the Eibishter's power, is completely, infinitely apart, and he created something completely different than himself. If it's yesh mi-yesh, how do you explain there's something in common? So how did bli gvul suddenly become gvul? The next problem, the concept of shina and spilus. If it's yesh mi-yesh, there's a shina and a spilus, and we know the Eibishter is not subject to change. The problem I'm having is the language that he's using here sounds like ulezeis yiksha. So first I thought it meant that's what bothers them. But ulezeis yiksha sounds more to me now, like he says in the next paragraph, that's why they have a question. Because they're thinking of it all yesh mi-yesh. So those questions, that's why we have a question. That's why it's difficult to say it that way. But I have to still study it to make sure I'm right. So bottom line, he's saying, okay, that even when we say the Eibishter's koich hapoel benifel, he still remains apart. He chose to, yes, apply himself to say yehi oyer, and to invest himself with a particular divine energy that enters into daimim, tzemeach, chai, medaber, into each particular creation. But that doesn't make God something in common with us. Because if it's something in common, then you wouldn't be able to explain how from bli gvul came gvul. That's what he's saying here. So even when you say koich hapoel benifel, so therefore you have to say that they still remain infinitely apart. Ulezeis yiksha means, even though it says yiksha lehem, it means, and that's what's difficult to say like they do, because how did something that's perishable come from koich haliki, which is not perishable? V'gam oizeis yiksha lehem. And another thing that's not understood according to their approach, if it's yesh mi-yesh, like we said before, the two differences, then there should be a shinui. Just like there's a shinui from the teacher after he teaches and before he teaches. Or like he says, like we learned before, because in this case, if it's comparable to how way we work, so then the koyach hapoel benifel al-kiba pel nifred ma'atzmei. It like separated itself. That means there's a shinui. According to them, that the chokhmah, the wisdom in creation, that's comparable to what he gave an example before. The intelligence that's busy and invested in the Maisa Binyan. When you're conceiving, devising, and creating a building, there's a wisdom that's invested in that. Oy haksav, or the wisdom in something that you write. That seichel, like we learned before, manifests itself in the action. The ksiva zu, oitzir, oy binyan mamish, in this piece of writing or in this image. Now he's bringing the example of a picture, oy binyan mamish, or in the building that you're building. Ukanal, like we learned before, shekol shebasiya sheshayich la'esis ha'maisa dafke. I'm sorry, seichel shebasiya. My mistake. We learned earlier that the seichel and asiya has a shaychus to the esis of maisa dafke. So you could have a seichel that's an abstract idea and is beyond maisa, but a seichel that's invested, seichel shashia, is like the oisius within the maisa, because it's giving it direction, shape, and form. So this is all, if you would say, it's yesh mi-yesh. All these questions are there. because it means then that there's something that should be in common, and therefore how to get bleak balgul from gvul, from built
Can you take a
finite
question?
from infinite, and the second thing, it should create a shinui, because that's what yesh miyesh does. He's elaborating now back on that muscle. And when his entire mind is now concentrated in the building, the Maisa Binyan, in the action of building a building, and the koyach hasichli, the very core power of his intelligence, is busy with this. Lahaskil seichel b'maisa zu, to conceive of ideas. That's what he's planning. He can't be doing something else. He's completely immersed in the planning of this structure, in this action. That creates a shini. When you're busy invested in thinking about planning something, your seichel is absolutely being impacted by that. And he brings now proof for this. Because as soon as he stops thinking about it, shevis haseichel means he rests his mind from this entity, or from this endeavor and action. The thing he's writing, or the building that he's building. Then the seichel returns back within himself, because he's now not investing it in this particular project. And then it becomes a mufshet, separate from, and mufshet means removed from and separate from the ma'aseh that it was invested in. Just like when you throw a stone, when you're invested in throwing the stone, your energy is in there. But then when you stop, the so-called energy goes back into the source. And then it's in a different quality, because you're not investing it in this, and now can be invested in other things. So that's a shinui. A shinui from the time that you invest your mind in some project, and when you stop thinking about the project. It's in a higher quality. Because when he delves himself, immerses himself, and he concentrates his mind very much so in the asiyah that he's building, in the action. That's a great descent from his very core intelligence, because he's now directing it toward this particular project. To the point that its personality changes of the seichel. Ube'emes, however, all this does not apply. So that's why you can't say yesh miyesh. Ube'emes halo yedua de lamayla lo yetaken lemer kinus hashinu klal. Above, by Hashem, you can't apply any type of change. Ben kedim ha'mam shochev ha'ashpal lishtalshus elemis. There's some change from before the transmission and the manifestation in shtalshlus ha'elemis, like it says, I, God, do not change. That you're the same one before you created to the one that's after created. Without any change. And if you say that God is like Yesh Miyesh, that when he invests in creation, it's like we invest in our work, that creates shinui. You can't say all that. Let me just to finish the topic, the next paragraph. All these problems, how from infinite becomes finite, and how can there be a creation without change? These questions only are there according to their theory. That the creation came cause and effect. That's yesh yesh, and there these questions would all apply. But in truth, you cannot say that the creation happened in that manner. That you can compare it like they do to every type of flow and every type of transmission. I'm going to stop here because there's more to say, but I just don't want to. There's a lot more going on. So therefore, all these questions fall off, because since it's happening yesh ma'ayin, there's nothing in common. So number one, you could have, therefore from bli gvul can come gvul, and number two is there's no shinei in spilus because there's nothing in common. He's not investing himself like we invest in work we do, which has an effect on us. I was just what threw me was the way he voiced it. I thought he was explaining why they say it. That was not correct. He was saying that these questions apply the way they understand it. You have these questions. So we still need to understand why the early Mekubalim had this approach, which, as I said, I'll get back to after we finished. I'll talk about that. I also want to look it up in the sources. So the topic is not over. He's still going to address this, but a lot of what we just read is actually quoted in Ayin Beis on page 1467 and 1468. And I'll compare that next class when we finish the topic here, and then we'll go back. The bottom line is, what he's done is shown us the difference between the approach of Yesh Miyesh, which has the two elements. Number one, that there's something in common between them, and there's a shinui and a spilus. And Yesh Ma'ayin, where those things, there's nothing in common, and there's no shinui and spilus. And Yeshem leishanisi. That's the punchline in this whole discussion. But as I said, it's not finished yet. But due to time, we're going to stop here. Beginning of the paragraph, the second paragraph on 375. Any questions?
I have a few questions, and I know that we've been through these topics in general in Ayin Beis, but so my questions are going to come to inquire into these two principles of nothing in common between the creator and the created, and no change in the creator as a result of the creation. I recognize those are the two fundamental points being made about the difference between Yesh Miyesh versus Ayin Miyesh. But if you take the first one, nothing in common. So we understand, and again, I'm coming at this, well, I'll just make the question. We understand everything's elokus, and everything's godliness. And so to say that there's nothing in common between, and let's take a human being, the quintessential creation of God. I have a neshama. It's a chelek common mamash. So I know it's like my yechida says, it's like it doesn't manifest much, but it's in there. There's something in common between me and God. I have a piece of him. That's one. And in terms of let
me answer that immediately. You asked that question. I guess my memory is better than yours. You asked exactly that question when we learned this idea in Ayin Beis.
Wow.
And I answered the following. We're talking about creation on its own. God gave us a neshama. Of course, God can infuse into a creation something of himself. But that's not because we have it due to our own merit, our own value. That's exactly what I answered to that question when you asked me that. So God can take existence and then put a neshama in there. But if you take the creation of itself by itself, it doesn't have any of its own merit of that level. There's nothing in common fundamentally. It's only, if anything, that we have that's similar to godly is because God said, I want you to have something from me. That's more or less what I said. Okay. Secondly, we'll get there because we're gonna, as we continue learning, you'll see we discussed in Ayin Beis and as well as here. But go ahead.
Okay, well, it's interesting how I'm having a hard time wrapping my mind around but okay, that's part one. And then in terms of Ein Shinui, now coming out from the other angle, like let's say he's saying the Rav or the teacher, there's something that's, I guess, depleted. Maybe not depleted, but you're saying you're occupied in the process of creation, Yesh Miyesh, that there's something, but so I guess in the moment of you, so to speak, creating an idea in my mind, you're giving me an idea I never had before. There's no shinui in you. You have that idea. You're explaining it to me. Okay, you're occupied with it. You can't do more than one or two things at the same time. Like you can't do 1,000,001 tasks at the same time.
So what's the question?
There's no change in you. When you teach me something, let's say Aleph of Chassidus, it's not changing you. You're giving me the Aleph. So what?
You can't figure out the answer to that?
Well, like I said, you're occupied in teaching me, so it's changing you.
That's a shinui. That's a immediate shinui. As soon as you're occupied, you can't do something else. it means that you're not removed, it's affecting you. And a
Mhm.
teacher who exerts himself in teaching a student gets tired.
Yeah,
He can get back his energy, like he says,
I
after he
see.
finishes.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. That was okay. Thank you.
Well, this is all part of the Izbanus of what we're ultimately going to learn about Hashem Echad, obviously.
Yes.
We're still in the middle of the topic, so I just want to tell you and everybody that there's more to come, and we already learned it in Ayin Beis, just for the record, but we'll learn it here, and I'm going to compare it, and you'll see a lot of the topics. If you go back to the original classes in Ayin Beis, we addressed them at length then.
Oh, I know. What's disturbing me is just myself, nothing to do with you. Your teaching's fine. Is that it's some reason it hasn't sunken in fully enough for me not to have these questions. Whatever.
That's perfectly fine. That's the process of learning and integrating. I have no issue
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah.
It takes time. That's fine. I am not suggesting that you have to already understand it all. I am just saying that as we learn more, we're going to get into it more, and we've already discussed, and we'll discuss more. That's all I'm saying. It's an ongoing process.
Understood.
That's all.
Well, that's the beauty of doing these ideas essentially 3 times.
No, by all means, and I think it's very valuable for all of us, for myself as well. The more we reinforce the topics, remember, we're dealing here something we're trying to get a nefesh abamis to understand something that's not human, something divine, very different than the human, and it should be excited about it. So you can imagine it takes a lot of work to train an animal soul to understand these ideas. So that what you're describing is exactly the process. It takes work.
Yeah. Yeah. All right.
Because,
I appreciate it.
of course, yeah. Okay, good.
All right. Well, thank you for your patience answering my questions multiple times. You have a heck of a memory.
Perfectly fine. It's an obvious question, actually, and it's a good question. That's why I remember it, because it's a question we all have when we read this the first time, and that's why you need to remember. It comes down to, like, you learn a Shayachad V'Amunah, you learn how all of existence is completely nullified, meaning if God chose not to speak, all of existence ceased to be. And then on the other hand, in the first part of Tanya, he talks about Dira B'Tachtenim, how God wants existence, and every mitzvah, every detail of existence is absolutely necessary. So the first obvious question is, 1 second here. All of existence completely like nothing, and should the eye see the divine power, all of existence would cease to be. And then you say, what do you mean? Every piece of existence is so important in the Torah and the mitzvah, and this detail, that detail, and it's a matter of life and death. And the answer, of course, is existence on its own is completely bottled. But then God said, I want this existence to be my dira, and I want this cloth, this parchment to be tefillin, and I want this wool to be tzitzis, and this wax or this wick and oil to be a mitzvah candle for Shabbos, Chanukah, and so on. So then, what's basically one is, don't think you and existence are valuable because you think you're important. You're important because God made you important. That's the key thing to keep in mind.
Yeah. Sometimes, and God forbid, I don't mean this to sound profane, please, God, not just to you, but to this is being recorded. But I'm curious to hear a response to this, because everything you just said prompts this question. And I've thought this many times. The first time I'm articulating this. It feels like all of creation is one big thought experiment by God. It's real. It sure is real for us, but everything is godliness and everything is God. This is his experiment. All of creation is God's experiment. And essentially it's like he's set himself off, part of himself off to operate, and he wants it to work out a certain way, that we will make certain choices as to make it shlemus, and he's going to come down into this existence, and it's going to be a successful experiment. But let's say chas v'shalom, we don't do the right things. I mean, it's impossible because God can't make a mistake, but it's almost like it's a thought project. If he stops thinking, poof, we're gone. And yet there's all these hischalkus, like you said, infinite degrees of particularity in the creation, and all these details matter, and yet they're both true. You see, it's very perplexing. What do you think
Well,
about that?
I think because God is not limited by non-existence, and the same God that where all existence doesn't exist can also choose existence. That's the whole point of the Yichud. If you remember, the highest level of Yichud we learned in Torah Shalom is the same God where all of existence doesn't exist. That same God says, I want existence.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore it has that atzmistic value because God wants it.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're speaking the parameters of logic either exists or doesn't exist. But what about an entity that doesn't exist and does exist at the same time? Remember, God does not exist either. So he doesn't exist and does not exist. That's built to Metzias Nim. So he's beyond existence and beyond non-existence. That's why he can have create an existence that has real value.
You could do a whole class on what you just said.
I have, by the way, quite a few times, and we'll talk about it more.
Okay. Well, thank you for answering that. I'm probably thinking about that all weekend. It's not the first time you said it, but the first time you said
Not
it.
the first time. I also spoke, if you remember, about Tzimtzum Nikra Kalim, that the Tzimtzum itself has substance. It's not just concealment. There's a whole sikh of the Rebbe I discussed a number of times. In my chapter on God in Torah Meaningful Life, I talk about it as well in simple English.
I may go check that out today. How's the book camp? Well, we'll do it later after you stop the recording. Oh, can I just say one more time? Can I just make a pitch real quick, please?
Sure.
Yeah. So, as some people in the WhatsApp group know that I put out a text message, but Rabbi Jacobson is seeking his organization, the Meaningful Life Center, seeking donations to help fund the special edition printing of a special edition of his famous book, Toward a Meaningful Life, Wisdom of the Rebbe, and giving this special edition to the combat soldiers in the IDF in gift bags that are being distributed. There's a distribution network set up, and the copies are already, tens of thousands of copies already being published. And the cost of this publication is at least $300,000 to $400,000. Rabbi Jacobson successfully raised some money, but not all of it per se. And we're each trying to make donations. If you can, please, instead of your annual gift to the Meaningful Life Center, he's not doing his annual fundraising campaign. There's no Hanukkah campaign, you may have noticed. So please go to the WhatsApp group, and I'll repost the link, make a donation. Any amount matters. We're going for 100% participation. You know, give what you can give. $18, $100, $180. If you give $100, you get a free copy of the special edition. Very few people in the world will have this. If you give $180 or more, you get a hand-signed copy from Rabbi Jacobson with a personal inscription. So please, before the end of the year, it's time to give, make tzedakah, get some tax deductions, give whatever you can. Any amount is helpful. I'm going to be calling people if you haven't already been called. So please give from your hearts before the end of the year. Get that tax deduction, and more importantly, get that schus. You know, be part of the blessing. Let's all be spiritual warriors as we help our soldiers to prevail over evil and in the Holy Land. And good job, everybody.
Amen. Thank you so much for that. Thank you. So we will conclude here, page 375.